I found the letter in my father's safety deposit box 3 days after his funeral. It was addressed to me, but the handwriting wasn't his. Inside was a single photograph of 17 children standing in front of a brick building, their faces blurred as if someone had deliberately smudged the image. On the back, written in fading ink, Millhaven, West Virginia. They're still waiting. 1974. My father had circled one child in red marker. The date made my blood run cold. That was the year he left West Virginia and never spoke of it again. That was the year before I was born. And that circled child looked exactly like me. The letter that accompanied the photograph was typed on an old typewriter, the kind that leaves impressions on the paper. Mr. Chen, your father made us promise to wait until he was gone. The silence has lasted 50 years. The children deserve the truth. Come to Millhaven. Ask for the Pritchard house. Bring the photograph. They need to know someone remembers. It was signed simply E.M. I am David Chen, 48 years old, a documentary researcher for public television. I've spent my career investigating forgotten stories, but I never imagined I'd be investigating my own father's past. The man I knew was quiet, methodical, obsessed with routine. He never spoke about his childhood, never mentioned West Virginia. When I asked as a teenager, he would simply say, "Some places are better left in memory, David." Now I understood. He wasn't talking about memory. He was talking about silence. Millhaven, West Virginia sits in the Appalachian Mountains, about 40 miles from the nearest interstate. Population in 2024, 83 people. In 1974, it was home to nearly 4,000. The town was built around the Pritchard chemical plant, which opened in 1952 and promised prosperity to a region devastated by coal mine closures. For 2 decades, Millhaven thrived. Then in October 1974, something happened. The official records are sparse. The plant closed due to economic factors. Within 6 months, 80% of the population had left. The remaining families stayed for reasons that made less sense the more I researched. Loyalty to the land, nowhere else to go, or something darker. The photograph haunted me during the 3-hour drive from Pittsburgh. Who were these children? Why did one of them look like a younger version of me? And what did my father have to do with any of this? I arrived in Millhaven on a Tuesday in late October. The town felt wrong the moment I crossed the bridge over Blackwater Creek. The trees were the wrong color for autumn, their leaves a sickly yellow-brown instead of the vibrant reds and oranges covering the rest of West Virginia. Main Street consisted of boarded-up storefronts with faded signs. Murphy's General Store, Millhaven Pharmacy, the Copper Kettle Diner. Only one building showed signs of life, a small post office with an American flag hanging limp in the still air. An elderly woman sat on a folding chair outside, watching me with the intensity of someone who doesn't see strangers often. I pulled over and approached her carefully. "Excuse me, ma'am, I'm looking for the Pritchard house." Her expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes. Recognition, maybe, or warning. "You're Chen's boy." It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am. Did you know my father?" She stood slowly, joints crackling like dry wood. "Everybody knew David Chen. He was there that day." She pointed down the street toward a cluster of houses barely visible through the trees. "Eleanor Pritchard still lives in the big Victorian at the end of Maple Street. White house with blue shutters. Can't miss it." She paused, studying my face. "You look just like him, you know. Same eyes, same way of standing." Then she added almost to herself, "I hope you're ready for what she's going to tell you." The Pritchard house was exactly as described, though calling it white was generous. The paint had faded to a grey that matched the overcast sky, and several shutters hung at odd angles. But the property was meticulously maintained. The lawn was cut, the hedges trimmed, the walkway swept clean. Someone still cared about this place. I knocked on the door, and it opened almost immediately, as if she'd been watching me approach. Eleanor Pritchard was in her late 70s, thin as a rail, with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun. Her eyes were sharp, intelligent, and filled with something I couldn't quite identify. Relief, perhaps. Or fear. "Mr. Chen, I've been expecting you for 50 years. She gestured me inside. The house was a museum of another era. Furniture from the 1960s, wallpaper with faded floral patterns, photographs covering every available surface. But it was the photographs that made me stop breathing. Dozens of them. Hundreds, maybe. All of children, all slightly blurred, as if taken through dirty glass or captured while moving. "You recognize them," Eleanor said, watching me. "The photograph you received, it's from the Millhaven School for Advanced Learning. That's what they called it, the public name." She moved to a cabinet and withdrew a thick manila folder, its edges worn soft with handling. The private name was Project Chrysalis. Your father was one of 17 children selected for the program in 1973. He was 14 years old. I sat down without being invited, my legs suddenly unreliable. "What kind of program?" Eleanor's hands trembled as she opened the folder. Inside were documents, forms, photographs, all marked with official-looking stamps. The Pritchard chemical plant wasn't just making pesticides and industrial solvents, Mr. Chen. They had a government contract, Department of Defense. They were developing something called Compound X7, a cognitive enhancement drug designed to improve memory, learning capacity, problem-solving. The military applications were obvious, but they needed to test it on developing brains to understand its long-term effects. She pulled out a photograph. It was the same one from my father's safety deposit box, but clearer. I could see the faces now. 17 children, ages 12 to 15, standing in front of a brick building that looked like a school, but had no windows on the upper floors. My father's young face stared back at me from the second row. The resemblance was undeniable. They selected children whose families worked at the plant. Poor families, Mr. Chen. Families who couldn't afford to say no when the company offered to pay for their children's education, provide free medical care, guarantee college scholarships. The parents signed consent forms they barely understood, forms that gave Pritchard chemical complete medical authority over their children for a period of 3 years. I forced myself to speak. "You're telling me my father was experimented on? I'm telling you that 17 children were given experimental drugs 5 days a week for 8 months. They were told it was vitamins, advanced nutrition for gifted students. The pills were small, white, tasteless. For the first few months, nothing seemed wrong. The children's grades improved. They retained information faster, solved complex problems with ease. Parents were thrilled. The company was thrilled. Then the side effects began." Eleanor's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "It started with the dreams. All 17 children began having identical nightmares. They would wake up screaming about shadows with wrong faces, about rooms with no doors, about voices that spoke in frequencies that made their teeth hurt. The company doctors said it was stress, growing pains, adolescent anxiety. They increased the dosage." She showed me a page from what looked like a medical log. The handwriting was precise, clinical. "Week 18. Subject 7, Chen David, reports persistent visual distortions, sees patterns behind patterns in ordinary objects. Duration, 3 to 7 minutes. Frequency, increasing. Cognitive function, elevated. Continue protocol." My hands were shaking now. "What happened to them?" Eleanor moved to the window, looking out at the grey afternoon. "In October 1974, something went catastrophically wrong. The company called it an unexpected interaction between the compound and naturally occurring environmental factors. What actually happened was that compound X7 caused severe neurological damage. When combined with certain chemicals the children were being exposed to in the school building itself. The building's insulation contained asbestos treated with another experimental fire retardant, also manufactured by Pritchard. The two compounds created a synergistic toxic effect. On October 13, 1974, all 17 children suffered simultaneous seizures during morning assembly. They collapsed within seconds of each other, as if someone had flipped a switch. Paramedics found them on the floor, unconscious, bleeding from their ears and noses. Your father was one of them. I couldn't process what I was hearing. My father, the quiet man who worked as an accountant, who lived a carefully controlled life, who never raised his voice or showed emotion, had survived neurological experimentation as a child. How many survived? I asked, though part of me didn't want to know the answer. 14 of the 17 children woke up in the hospital 3 days later. 3 never regained consciousness. They were transferred to a private facility, and their families were told they had contracted a rare viral infection. The families were paid substantial settlements in exchange for signing non-disclosure agreements. The 3 children who never woke up officially, they died of complications from viral encephalitis. Unofficially, they were kept alive on life support in a facility 2 states away until they finally died naturally years later. The company couldn't risk autopsies revealing what had been done to them. Eleanor turned back to me, and I saw tears in her eyes. My husband, Robert Pritchard, was the plant manager. He authorized the program. When he realized what had happened, what he'd allowed to happen to those children, he tried to stop it. He went to the Department of Defense, threatened to expose everything. 2 weeks later, he died in a car accident. Single vehicle, late at night, drove off a cliff. The police ruled it accidental. I knew better. She wiped her eyes roughly. The 14 surviving children were released from the hospital with clean bills of health. Their medical records were sealed. Their families were paid. Most of them left Millhaven within months, scattered across the country, told never to speak of what happened. Your father was one of them. He changed his name, created a new identity, and spent the rest of his life trying to forget. I stood up, pacing the small living room, trying to organize the chaos in my mind. Why didn't anyone expose this? Why didn't the families go public? They were terrified, Mr. Chen, and they were paid very well to stay silent. But more than that, they were told that speaking out would endanger their children further. The company claimed the treatment was ongoing, that the children needed regular monitoring, that any stress or public attention could trigger relapses. It was a lie, but the families believed it, or pretended to believe it. Silence became a survival strategy. She picked up another folder, this one even thicker. Over the years, I've tracked what happened to the 14 survivors. I became obsessed with it after Robert died. It was my way of atoning for what my family's company had done. The results were troubling. Of the 14 children who survived, 12 developed severe psychiatric disorders in their 20s and 30s. Depression, anxiety, paranoid schizophrenia. 7 committed suicide before the age of 40. 3 died of brain tumors. Your father was one of only 2 who seemed to live relatively normal lives, though I suspect normal is not the word his family would use. I thought about my father's rigid routines, his emotional distance, his absolute refusal to discuss his past, his insistence on yearly medical checkups, his paranoia about pharmaceutical companies, his nightmares that would sometimes wake the household when I was a child. My mother had always said he had an old soul weighed down by things he couldn't share. Now I understood. He wasn't weighted down. He was holding himself together through sheer force of will. You said there's one other survivor who lived a normal life. Who? Eleanor consulted her notes. Sarah Mitchell. She married, had children, worked as a teacher in Oregon. Last I heard, she was still alive, though she developed early-onset Alzheimer's in her 60s. I wrote to her several times over the years. She never responded, but she never moved either, never changed her name. I think she wanted to be found if anyone ever came looking. I made a mental note to contact Sarah Mitchell, though I suspected that conversation would be as difficult as this one. Eleanor, why now? Why send me that letter after my father died?" She sat down heavily in an armchair that had probably been her husband's. "Because the truth is coming out whether we want it or not. 3 months ago, a graduate student at West Virginia University started researching the economic collapse of Appalachian towns in the 1970s. She found references to Millhaven, to the sudden population exodus, to sealed court records involving Pritchard Chemical. She's been asking questions, filing Freedom of Information requests. The story is going to break, probably within the next year. When it does, the focus will be on the company, on the government contracts, on the cover-up. But no one will remember the children. No one will know their names or their faces or what was taken from them." She held up the photograph again, the 17 blurred faces staring at me across 5 decades. "Your father made me promise that when he was gone, I would make sure someone knew the truth about the children, not the clinical details or the legal settlements, but the human cost. He wanted you to know because he loved you, Mr. Chen, even if he couldn't show it the way other fathers do. The medication, the experiments, they didn't just damage his brain, they damaged his ability to feel emotions the way normal people do. Everything was muted, distant, like watching life through thick glass. But he chose to have a family anyway. He chose to try. That took more courage than you can imagine." I felt tears on my face and didn't bother wiping them away. "Can I see the rest of the documents?" For the next 3 hours, Eleanor walked me through 50 years of tragedy. Medical records, testimony transcripts from sealed depositions, photographs of the children at various stages, before and after. I saw my father's face change over the months of the program, saw the light in his eyes dim, saw the careful blankness settle over his features like a mask he'd wear for the rest of his life. I saw the death certificates of the children who hadn't survived, each one listing causes that had nothing to do with the truth. Sudden cardiac failure, cerebral aneurysm, complications from undiagnosed congenital condition. I saw the financial records showing the settlements paid to families, amounts that would be worth millions in today's dollars. Blood money, every cent of it. And I saw photographs of the Pritchard chemical plant, the brick building where my father spent 8 months being poisoned, the laboratories where compound X7 was manufactured, the school where 17 children were turned into test subjects. The plant had been demolished in 1982, the land remediated and sold. It was now a shopping centre parking lot, as if it had never existed. "There's one more thing," Eleanor said, as evening began to fall outside. "Your father wrote something. I found it among Robert's papers after he died. I think Robert had asked your father to document his experience, perhaps for legal purposes. Your father was only 14, but his writing, you'll see." She handed me several pages of lined notebook paper, covered in my father's teenage handwriting. The writing was precise, controlled, each letter carefully formed. I recognized the penmanship, the same careful script he'd used decades later on birthday cards and grocery lists. But the content was devastating. "My name is David Chen. I am 14 years old. Today is November 3rd, 1974. I am writing this because Dr. Pritchard says it's important to document what happened, even though the company says we must never speak of it. I don't know if anyone will ever read this, but if they do, I want them to understand what it was like. The pills started in February. They told us we were gifted students, that we had been selected for advanced academic training. My parents were so proud. My father worked on the factory floor, inhaling chemical fumes for 12 hours a day. My mother cleaned houses. The idea that their son could go to college, could have a different life, meant everything to them. How could they refuse? At first, the pills made me feel sharper, faster. I could memorize entire textbook pages after reading them once. Math problems that used to take me hours, I could solve in minutes. I felt like I was becoming someone better, smarter, more capable. But then the dreams started. I would dream that I was standing in a room made of doors, and every door I opened led to another room of doors, infinite and impossible. I would dream that my thoughts had colors and weights, that I could see them floating around me like objects. I would dream that I was multiple people existing simultaneously, each version of me making different choices, and I could feel them all at once. When I woke up, I couldn't always remember which version of me was real. The doctors said this was normal, that my brain was adapting to enhanced cognitive function. They increased the dosage. I had to stop reading for a moment, the words blurring through my tears. This was my father at 14, articulate and self-aware, describing his own destruction in real time. In October, everything changed. We were in assembly, listening to Principal Morrison talk about something I can't remember now. I was sitting between Thomas Garrett and Julie Fan. I remember thinking that Julie's hair smelled like strawberries, and Thomas was clicking his pen, and those are the last normal thoughts I had before the world ended. It felt like my brain was too large for my skull, like pressure building behind my eyes, in my sinuses, at the base of my neck. I remember turning to say something to Thomas, and then there was no floor, no ceiling, just a sensation of falling through layers of reality like someone dropping through thin ice, each layer breaking beneath me. I heard screaming and realized it was coming from me, from all of us, 17 voices making the same sound. Then nothing. When I woke up in the hospital 3 days later, everything was wrong. Colors were too bright. Sounds were too loud. I could see patterns in the ceiling tiles that made my stomach hurt. The doctors ran tests, took blood, asked questions I couldn't answer. My parents sat beside my bed and cried. I wanted to comfort them, but I couldn't feel anything. It was like all my emotions had been wrapped in cotton, distant and muted. I knew I should feel sad or scared or angry, but I couldn't access those feelings. They were behind glass. They told us that 3 of our classmates had died. Jennifer Park, Marcus Wilson, and Amy Rodriguez. They told us it was a virus, an infection, nothing to do with the program. But we knew. We all knew. We could see it in each other's eyes, the knowing. We'd been changed, damaged, and 3 of us hadn't survived the change. The company paid my parents $40,000. They made us sign papers saying we'd never talk about the program, never mention Compound X7, never connect the plant to what happened to us. My father took the money because he had no choice. We left Millhaven 3 months later. I enrolled in a new school under a new name. I learned to pretend to feel things I couldn't feel. I learned to imitate normal human behavior by watching others carefully and mimicking their responses. I became very good at pretending to be someone I wasn't. Or maybe I became very good at pretending to be someone I used to be. The last page was dated March 1975, 4 months after the incident. I am writing this final entry to say goodbye to the person I was before the pills. That David Chen died in October 1974, along with Jennifer and Marcus and Amy. The person I am now wears his name and his face, but I am not him. I am what the company made me. I am living evidence of what happens when profit matters more than children. If anyone ever reads this, if the truth ever comes out, I want them to know we were just kids. We trusted the adults who said they wanted to help us. And they destroyed us. I set the pages down, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped them. Eleanor sat quietly, giving me time to process. Outside, night had fallen completely, and the house was silent except for the ticking of an old clock somewhere in another room. Finally, I found my voice. What do you want me to do with this information? Eleanor stood and moved to a closet, pulling out a cardboard box I hadn't noticed before. Everything is in here. Copies of all the documents, photographs, testimonies, your father's writing. The originals I'm donating to the West Virginia State Archives with instructions that they be sealed for 10 years after my death. But you should have copies. Your father wanted you to have them. What you do with them is your choice." She paused. "But I hope you'll tell their story, Mr. Chen. I hope you'll make sure the 14 children who survived and the 3 who didn't are remembered as more than footnotes in a corporate scandal. They were real people with real lives that were stolen from them. They deserve to be more than statistics." I took the box, feeling its weight, the weight of 50 years of silence and suffering. "I'm a documentary researcher, Eleanor. This is what I do. I promise you I'll tell their story. All of them." She smiled then, the first genuine smile I'd seen from her. "Your father would be proud. He always hoped you'd be the one to break the silence. He just couldn't do it himself. The damage was too deep, the fear too ingrained. But he knew you could." We stood in that old house for another hour, Eleanor filling in details, answering questions, sharing memories of a town that used to be alive before it was hollowed out by greed and lies. She told me about the families who stayed, the ones who couldn't afford to leave or couldn't bear to abandon the graves of children who died too young. She told me about the annual memorial they held in secret every October 13th, just the remaining families acknowledging what had been taken from them. She invited me to attend this year's memorial, 3 days away. I accepted. The memorial was held in the basement of the old Methodist church, the only religious building in Millhaven still maintained. 32 people attended, most of them elderly, all of them somehow connected to the 17 children. Parents, siblings, childhood friends who remembered the truth even as the official history tried to erase it. They had set up 17 chairs in a circle, each with a photograph and a name card. My father's chair held the photograph from the safety deposit box, his teenage face staring out at the gathering. I sat behind his chair, feeling like an intruder in a grief that wasn't quite mine, but had shaped my entire life. One by one, people stood and shared memories. Thomas Garrett's sister remembered how he used to build elaborate machines from scrap metal, how he dreamed of becoming an engineer. After the program, he lost the ability to visualize in 3 dimensions. He worked in a warehouse until he died of a brain tumor at 38. Julie Phan's mother, now in her 90s, remembered her daughter's laugh, bright and musical. After the program, Julie rarely laughed. She became a librarian, married briefly, and took her own life at 34. One after another, the stories poured out, each one a testament to a life interrupted, a potential never realized, a person fundamentally altered against their will. When it came to my father's turn, I stood on shaking legs. I told them about the man I knew, the distant but present father who never missed a school event, who taught me to be careful and deliberate, who protected me in ways I was only now beginning to understand. I told them that he had ensured the truth would survive him, that he had spent 50 years carrying this burden in silence so that eventually someone could speak it aloud. I told them I would make sure the world knew what happened to the children of Millhaven. When I finished, an elderly man approached me. He was stooped, weathered, but his eyes were sharp. "I'm Frank Garrett, Thomas's father. Your father and my son were best friends before the program, after they couldn't really connect anymore. The damage made it hard for them to maintain relationships. But Thomas told me once, maybe a year before he died, that David Chen was the strongest person he'd ever known. Said it took superhuman strength to survive what they'd survived and still choose to live, still choose to build a life, even a small one. He admired your father's courage. He pressed something into my hand, a small metal object, worn smooth by handling. Thomas made this in shop class before the program. It's a mechanical butterfly, see? You wind it up and the wings move. He gave it to your father the day before they collapsed. I found it in David's hospital room, after your family left town. I've been keeping it all these years, hoping someday I could return it. I think your father would want you to have it." I wound the butterfly carefully, and its delicate wings began to move, a tiny mechanical miracle preserved across 5 decades. It should have made me sad. This relic of a friendship destroyed by corporate greed. Instead, it made me angry. A clean, focused anger that burned away the confusion and grief. These children had been robbed. My father had been robbed, and the people responsible had never faced justice, had never even acknowledged what they'd done. That was going to change. I spent the next 3 months diving deeper into the story than I'd initially planned. I tracked down the remaining survivors of the original 17. Sarah Mitchell, the teacher in Oregon, agreed to speak with me on camera, though her Alzheimer's made the conversation difficult. But in her clearer moments, she remembered everything. The taste of the pills, the texture of the dreams, the moment of collapse, the lifetime of living behind glass. I found the adult children of Julie Phan and Marcus Wilson, people like me who'd grown up wondering why their parents were different, distant, damaged in ways that didn't have names. I found former Pritchard chemical employees willing to speak anonymously about the things they'd seen, the experiments they'd been told to forget, the documents they'd been ordered to destroy. I obtained the sealed court records through a Freedom of Information request, leveraging my credentials as a documentary researcher and the fact that 50 years had passed. The documents revealed a conspiracy that reached higher than I'd imagined. Department of Defense contracts worth millions, approval from officials who are now long dead, a systematic program of human experimentation that involved not just Millhaven, but 4 other small towns across the country. Millhaven was just the one where it went catastrophically wrong. I interviewed Dr. Helen Morrison, now 89, the principal of the Millhaven School for Advanced Learning. She had authorized the program, signed the forms, administered the pills. Now, facing the end of her life, she wanted to confess. "We thought we were helping them," she told me, her voice breaking. "We genuinely believed the company when they said it was safe, that it had been tested, that we were giving these children opportunities they'd never have otherwise. When they collapsed, when 3 of them died, I realized we'd been used. We'd been tools in an experiment that had nothing to do with helping children and everything to do with profit and military applications. I've lived with that guilt every day for 50 years. I deserve whatever judgment history passes on me." The documentary took a year to produce. I worked with a team of investigative journalists, medical experts, historians, and legal analysts to build an airtight case. We titled it The Children of Chrysalis, America's Secret Experiment. It aired on PBS as a 3-part series and simultaneously as a feature-length documentary. The response was immediate and explosive. Within a week, it had been viewed over 10 million times online. Major news outlets picked up the story. Survivors of similar programs in other towns came forward. Journalists dug into the financial records of Pritchard Chemical and traced the money to current pharmaceutical companies that had acquired its assets. Class action lawsuits were filed. Congressional hearings were scheduled. The Department of Defense was forced to acknowledge the program's existence and release previously classified documents. But the response that mattered most to me came from the families. The siblings, children, and grandchildren of the 17 children contacted me to say thank you. Thank you for giving their loved ones names and faces and stories. Thank you for making sure the world knew what had been taken from them. Thank you for breaking the silence that had imprisoned them for 50 years. 6 months after the documentary aired, I returned to Millhaven. The town hadn't changed much. Still 83 souls clinging to a place that had betrayed them. But something was different. Someone had erected a memorial in the town square, a simple granite stone with 17 names carved into its surface. Jennifer Park, Marcus Wilson, Amy Rodriguez, and the 14 who survived but were never quite whole again, including David Chen. Eleanor Pritchard had died 3 weeks earlier, peacefully in her sleep. She had lived long enough to see the truth acknowledged, the silence broken. Her obituary mentioned that she spent her life seeking justice for wrongs committed by her family's company. I like to think she found some peace in the end. I placed my father's mechanical butterfly at the base of the memorial, winding it up one last time. Its tiny wings moved in the autumn breeze, a small gesture of beauty and precision, just like the lives of the 17 children who deserved so much more than they were given. Standing there, I thought about my father's words, written when he was just 14 years old. If anyone ever reads this, if the truth ever comes out, I want them to know. We were just kids. Now the world knows, Dad. Now everyone knows you were just kids. And that matters. That will always matter. The victims of Project Chrysalis weren't just statistics or sealed court records or footnotes in the history of corporate malfeasance. They were children with dreams and potential and lives that should have been full and rich and long. They were my father, who fought every day to be present for his family despite the damage that made feeling almost impossible. They were Thomas Garrett with his mechanical butterflies, Julie Fan with her musical laugh, Sarah Mitchell, who became a teacher despite everything. They were 17 children who trusted adults to protect them and were betrayed in the most fundamental way possible. The silence lasted 50 years, but silence, even long and heavy silence, can be broken. Truth has weight, it has mass, it endures. And now that the truth is spoken, now that their names are carved in stone and their stories are told, the children of Millhaven are finally free. I carry my father's words with me always. Those pages he wrote at 14, bearing witness to his own destruction. I carry the mechanical butterfly, its delicate wings still moving after all these years. I carry the knowledge that sometimes courage doesn't look like bravery. Sometimes it looks like getting up every morning when you can't feel joy, building a life when you can barely feel alive, loving your family when love is a concept you understand intellectually but can't experience emotionally. My father was a hero. All 17 of them were heroes, not because they survived, though survival took everything they had, but because they existed as testimonies to human resilience in the face of inhuman cruelty. Because their lives, however damaged, however difficult, mattered. They mattered then, they matter now, they will always matter. And as long as people remember their names and faces and stories, as long as the world knows what was done to the children of Millhaven, they will never be forgotten. The silence is broken. The truth is told. And somewhere, I hope my father knows that he was right to trust me with this burden. I hope he knows that his story, their story, has been heard. I hope he's finally at peace. The mechanical butterfly sits on my desk now as I write this, its wings still capable of movement despite 50 years of waiting. It reminds me that some things endure, some things survive, and some truths, no matter how long they're buried, will eventually find their way into the light. This is the story of 17 children who were stolen from themselves. This is the story of a silence that lasted 50 years. This is the story of the children of Millhaven, and they deserve to be remembered.